There's a lot of actually really interesting science that shows that cravings are tightly related to what it is that you're missing, which is why sometimes you get these weird cravings. You're like, why am I all of a sudden craving this thing? It's very likely that something or some ingredient in that food is something that you're actually lacking. And, it's really fascinating stuff.
This is Raising Mama, a hilariously honest podcast dedicated to unveiling the hidden realities of motherhood.
Our goal is to arm you with the information and tools you need to be your most confident and empowered self.
This podcast is packed with unfiltered testimonies, diverse perspectives, and expert opinions, along with a good dose of laughter and tears.
Leading you on this journey is my best friend, Megan Stander, who is a CEO, passionate maternal health advocate, and mom of 2 daughters.
Alongside me is my best friend, Chelsea Ledson, who is a mother, wife, and registered nurse with her master's specializing in women's health. Let's try to raise the next generation
by raising up mamas
and maybe raising a little hell.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, mamas.
Welcome back to Raising Mama. Welcome to today's episode where we will be exploring the incredible metabolic changes a woman undergoes during pregnancy and motherhood. To help us navigate the important topic, we are joined by Jordan Lull, a father and someone many of you might know as the forgettable fat guy on Instagram. Jordan's expertise on subjects like caffeine and metabolism and all the changes during pregnancy has made his 90-second reels particularly popular. As the founder of Grit Optimization and a certified nutritionist, personal trainer, and strength and conditioning coach, Jordan brings valuable insights into how these changes impact both mothers and their overall well-being. We'll also dive into the related topics like what makes a great trainer, exercise supplements, and the crucial role dads play in supporting their baby's health. So join us today. This is going to be such a great one because, as you may not know, me and Megan also went on one of Jordan's programs. So we'll tell you all about it. And welcome, Jordan. We're so excited to have you finally.
Likewise, privileged to be here. Looking forward to talking about
I'm excited for this one. I think
me too.
I can't remember. So we discovered Jordan on Instagram, like many other people, and I can't remember if it was you or me, but your reel popped up, and I was like, I love this guy. So for the people that have never seen one of your forgettable facts, what are they, and how did you get into this?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of like a passion project. I had a lot of, as a kid, I was insufferable. I always had this information. I was always correcting people. And I was, a horrible kid to be around, I'm sure. You think you know everything and you're like, these people have to know. And so I would butt in. And apparently I never really outgrew it. And so I've got like all this stuff, I'm as we were talking before, I'm a podcast and audiobook fiend. I'm always taking in all this information. It's super fascinating to me. And I'm like, how do I transmit this? Because I don't want to be the guy at parties like, hey, guess what I just learned, And so I was
Right.
like, Instagram may as well be the place to be. So I started kind of, I think January 1st, I started. I was like, that'd be a fun one to do. And my first one was like probably 3 or 4 minutes, maybe more, not trimmed, not very good at all. I like to think I got a little bit better at it. But they're down to 90 seconds now. That allows me to kind of trim. I've got a big whiteboard. I've got some on, caffeine during pregnancy or, women's brain shrink during pregnancy or vitamin D and magnesium. And I've got this huge board of like all the things magnesium does, how it interplays. And so I'll like trim it down to 90 seconds, make it somewhat reasonable for someone who doesn't care the way I do about certain things because I don't expect everyone to have the same passions. So I'm like, maybe this would be interesting to people. And it seems like getting it down to 90 seconds has been relatively helpful for, the people who come across and like, hey, it's an interesting, and that kind of helps funnel some of the people toward the business where I have of, the nutrition, coaching, personal training, and probably more than anything, I just enjoy, there's so much garbage, nutrition myths, bad training advice, fear mongering. It's like so many people in the comments are just, I don't even know what to eat anymore. Eggs are good and eggs are bad. Coffee's good, coffee's bad. And it's hopefully we can make a tiny little bit of a dent in our dark corner of the internet.
Love it. And you yourself lost 100 pounds, right?
I did. Yeah. I was, it's a little easier for a guy my size. I'm 6'3". I was 300 pounds at one point. And, I was thin as a kid, made a bunch of, bad decisions once I was, a single guy living on my own and, you know, uh, I was able to lose the weight in a way that wasn't very healthy, it wasn't anything that I would, do with my clients or as I would do with either of you. Is more like the Biggest Loser style, which is totally unsustainable. And the recidivism rate is super high because, if you cut your calories and then you go on a hard exercise, your body's by default, by design, going to fight you and say this is not working. So what we have to do is increase our hunger to get our, so it's,
Hmm.
it's very easy for the people to say, calories in, calories out, eat less, move more. And yes, that's true as an equation, but at the end of the day, that leaves out so many variables that are, critical. It's like, are you up, if you don't like your job, then just leave it and get a better job. It's kind of,
Mhm.
well, just eat less and move more. It's like, well, yeah, obviously, but that's not the issue. The issue is there's a lot more to it. And that's why, obviously in working with both of you, it's either weight loss or putting on muscle or whatever health goal people have. It's almost always more behavioral than a lack of knowledge. And so hopefully
Yeah.
in working with people, I'm able to emphasize that a little bit more than I can in 90-second clips on Instagram.
Yeah. And not just behavioral, like for me, it was like mental, emotional.
Mm.
Because like if there's, lots of external factors like that you're managing, then it can be tough to even get your like behavior where it needs to be. Or I guess it's all the same thing,
Mhm.
right? But
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big shifts that we'd probably talk about is, originally having, I dove into personal training because I was like, I'm not going to pay a trainer this much money. It's obscene. I'm just going to do it myself. So I learned it and I was like, oh, okay, I learned a lot of stuff. Got to a point where I'm like, even the literature that is used to, create the certifications and all that kind of stuff, there are a lot of errors in it if you dive in deep
Mm.
enough. And then there are all kinds of, I was like, that's not right. And so I was like, well, I can't, you know, get the exercise portion down and not know how to feed myself. So I got into nutrition, became a nutritionist. I was kind of trying to cover all the bases, became really passionate about it. I was like, I have to share this because I was doing it with family, I was doing it with friends. And then, you go to the gym and even a lot of other trainers, unfortunately, they're kind of stuck in mindsets that have been thoroughly debunked 10, 20,
Mm.
30 years ago.
mhm,
And so it was kind of like, how do I help people, having gone through that weight loss. There's so much, like you were saying, the emotional, the mental portion of it, that people don't appreciate how losing that much weight, how it changes the person, not just the body, but who a person is. And there's a lot of people who lose that kind of weight and become, almost tyrants. It's like, why can't everybody do it like me? And that's one of the
Mm.
things that'll kind of show a good trainer is whether they've lost the weight or not, whether they've adapted or not. It's meeting a client where they are and not expecting the client to become, as passionate as I am about this particular thing. You each have your things you're passionate about, and you don't expect me to do it. So, if you hire a trainer, it's I want that person to help me do it. I don't want to have to learn everything they did. So,
yeah,
and particularly in the context of what got me probably on the podcast more than anything is it's unbelievable the amount of neglect in both the scientific literature and in just, my wife. We have two kids, boy and a girl. Having watched her go through that process, the incredible amount of like grit and tenacity and strength, and I was just absolutely blown away having her, having watched her go through that process. Natural birth, no epidural form of anesthesia or anything like that. And I was blown away, couldn't be more fascinated. And so from there, I started focusing more on pregnancy and babies and like a lot of the stuff that I learned along the way. I was like, I didn't know this. How have I never heard this before? It's like the
mhm,
most fascinating stuff that women are able to do consciously, subconsciously, things that the body does to adapt to having a baby, to raising the baby. And, that's kind of what shifted my focus onto the matrescence specific, female
right.
specific stuff that I just find incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So like let's talk. I feel like the story starts with your metabolism,
Yep.
right? And
Yeah.
let's talk about like the female metabolism when they're pregnant and postpartum or even just in general.
Yeah. So maybe we could start with just kind of metabolism in general, because everybody's got their opinion on metabolism, and
Do they?
yeah, as though it's one thing, like metabolism is this. Here's, I hear all the time, here's what you have to do for your metabolism. It's like, okay, which one? Because everything you eat can be broken down into thousands of pieces and each one has its own metabolism. So, It's like when people say, here's what you have to do for your microbiome. Like that's
Mhm.
even under, with the current scientific literature, it is the most complex thing. No, the
Mhm.
world's leading experts don't fully understand it, and they're under no delusion that they fully understand it. And yet you have people walk up to you and be like, I understand the most complex, your skin is your microbiome, your insides are your microbiome. And so breaking it down to what we know, what we don't know, why don't we maybe break it into little, understandable pieces, and then we kind of go from there.
Perfect.
So what people typically mean by metabolism is what they're typically thinking of is that calories in, calories out. So we can't create energy. We're organic life forms. We have to eat. That's how we get fuel. Food is a blessing, not a curse, though in many circumstances that, the relationship with food has a lot to do with that. And so in consuming food, we can break it down into pieces. There the calories is the way you measure the amount of food that's come in. Obviously, there are different kinds of calories, but calorie itself is just the measure of the energy that's found in the chemicals, broken down in that food. So you've got the macronutrients, which is kind of like the main form where you got protein, carbs, and fats. Protein, we'll go with kind of simplicity here. Protein is kind of the structural portion that we use, everything from our collagen, our connective tissue, our muscle, all the hormones except for some of the steroid, some very few exceptions for the sexual hormones are all proteins. So proteins used for just about everything in the body. And then fats are used for energy. They're used for synthesizing hormones, cholesterol. Every single one of our cells needs and uses cholesterol. And then carbs, more than anything, are a good fuel source. Technically, we could live without them, but that's not because carbs aren't important. That means they're so critical to every cell in our body that even if we only eat fat and protein, we are perfectly adapted to create our own carbohydrates in the form of glucose that gets used or stored as glycogen stores in our muscles. And so that's how important it is. When people say it's not essential, that's because our body will actually make it by itself. If even if you go totally carnivore or totally keto, you can still be you can still have high blood pressure, which we've seen before, which is kind of a crazy phenomenon, but that's how important sugar is for general metabolism. And so pregnancy changes that a little bit, but that's kind of the calories inside, what we eat and what we do with it. And then on the calories outside is what we do with the energy. The biggest chunk of the metabolism is not voluntary. It's not is the basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate. It's a little bit of a difference, but we'll just call it, your basal metabolic rate. The great majority of the calories we use in a day, something like 2/3 up to 3/4, is just keeping the lights on. I could sit right here, not move, not eat, not walk, and I would be consuming the great majority of my body's calories just keeping my body going. And so that's the main chunk of it. That's about, we'll say for the purposes of this conversation, something like 2/3. And then there's exercise, which is technically called exercise activity thermogenesis, where we burn a small portion of the calories we do by just existing. And then there's the BMR is just existing. I know this is kind of, I promise we'll be over this little hump in just a second, but it's four things.
Yeah, before we started, he was like,
Sure.
guys, metabolism is so boring. He's like, I'm going to
It
do my
is.
very best. It's so important. Everyone
I will.
needs to know about it, but it's so boring.
I will give myself a 30-second time limit. So
And this is
calories
like
in
all
is
you geek out about. And you're like, it's pretty boring.
yeah, yeah, and
But
this is
no, it's
why what
important.
makes it to the videos is a small fraction of what goes in, behind the scenes. So
Okay. But we got it. So far, we talked about the
yeah,
4 macronutrients, how they go in, what they're used for, and then now we're talking about where do they go?
yeah,
Basically,
and
most
thanks
of
for the
it's
check
sent.
on that. I will, without realizing, just start going on. And so, well, to put a cap on it, exercise is a small portion of it. Keeping the lights on is the majority of it. Walking around the house, fidgeting, cooking, taking the trash out, things that you're moving but you're not actually exercising is actually significantly more than exercise. And then finally is just, it's called TEF, the thermic effective food. We have to actually use some energy to break up the food that we've consumed. So long story short, we've got in and we've got out. And so what we can do with that is kind of start breaking down how metabolism works, what we can do with it. And so we talked about diet. There's the macros and the micros. And one way that we can tie this into pregnancy particularly is one of the more common questions is prenatal vitamins or folate versus folic acid. And that's a big question. And it helps to kind of zoom out to what metabolism is to understand what's going on, because we can get so tied up with this micronutrient And, I think my first post on January 1st was, you don't need supplements. And, they can help filling gaps in a healthy diet, but you don't need supplements. However, they can definitely help, especially bridging the gap and holes in the diet. For example, folate has the same root word as foliage. It comes from leafy greens. So you can get it from that, great. If you can't, or if you're in a food desert, or you're in a place where the soil is depleted and you're not getting it, you can take folate. It's better than folic acid because it's more natural. There's a lot that goes in behind the sines, but it doesn't accumulate. So that's a big question. When possible,
So
and
wait,
good
is
supplement.
folate for I feel so dumb asking
No,
these
there.
questions as someone that's been pregnant twice, but I'm like, is folate related to being pregnant?
So in that's actually a great question. I should have zoomed out.
I
We'll
I
digress
have
for
an
just a second.
answer.
Of
I
course.
have an answer because I asked him this question. For those of you who know, I'm trying to get pregnant, and I was like trying to ask him about supplements, and I was like, "Oh, should I take my like multivitamin or should I take my like a prenatal vitamin?" And basically, if I remember correctly, this was the whole like folate versus folic acid thing, and he was saying how anyone can get a multivitamin which has is it folate in it? Is that right?
Or folic
Uh,
acid.
yeah, and then he was saying, but if you get the like prescribed um prenatal vitamin, that's the one that has the what is it?
Should be
Total.
folate.
Yeah, like this.
Unfortunately, yeah, supplements are kind of a wild west. If you don't
Yeah.
have a
So he
reputable
was like,
company
get
that's
the
actually.
prescribed prenatal because it actually has the micronutrient that like actually helps like your baby grow and develop, and that's what you really need. And like he was like splitting hairs for me, and he helped me like differentiate the two and why it was so important for someone like me who wants to be pregnant, who could be like have growing a baby, like the difference in why it's really important to maybe not just go with a standard multivitamin, but to go with the actual prenatal vitamins, which now I have his prenatal vitamin recommendation, and hopefully it's helping everything move along.
And it ties it into pregnancy, which is, particularly folate, because pregnancy is so metabolically active. You're creating an entire life from scratch. You're creating a new organ, the placenta, from scratch. Your blood volume goes up a couple liters, your blood pressure goes up, your insulin resistance, so to speak, goes up because now baby's taking all that sugar that it needs. And so you start using fat a little bit more. So your body starts to adapt. And so that's why you can see now, the quality of nutrition and diet that we have makes such a difference, because you can have, a lot of food of poor quality and you don't get the necessary micronutrients in the food, even if you're getting, sufficient proteins. Protein's a little, less, the micronutrients will come more from the stuff that doesn't necessarily make it into the macronutrients, and much like veggies, stuff like that, like the folate and foliage, leafy greens, fiber is incredibly important. And so the quality of food matters. When you're making a baby and you're making a placenta and you're making all this new blood and you're making all this new tissue, you need the materials to do it. And so a good quality diet and supplements can help kind of fill that gap. And so that's a great one.
What happens like if you don't get enough of this stuff?
Typically, there's a lot of actually really interesting science that shows that cravings are tightly related to what it is that you're missing, which is why sometimes you get these weird cravings. And you're like, why am I all of a sudden craving this thing? It's very likely that something or some ingredient in that food is something that you're actually lacking.
Hmm.
And it's really fascinating stuff. It's not really solid yet. I'd love to say, yeah, it's been proven. It's fascinating. I'm sure, as it's one of the limitations of research, is the only research that gets done is what was funded, which is kind of another one of the ones that, the research for pregnant women is just like glaringly lacking, because
Mm.
despite the fact that a woman's body is significantly more complex because of that whole process than men's, men get a lot more research dedicated to things that go on in the male body, which is significantly more simple. So it's kind of crazy. It's one of the reasons we kind of have to rely on just things like metabolism that's outside of that process relatively similar for both men and women. With, there are obviously differences, but zooming out ballpark, that's kind of the main and primary thing. And then everything from the amount of food that we get in a diet. Crash diets are really crazy right now. There are absolutely people who feel good on certain diets, like extreme elimination diets, whether it's just meat, just carnivore, just keto, plant-based, full raw vegan. obviously in working together, I don't demonize or attack any particular diet, but there are pros and cons to almost every diet. There is no one perfect diet for any, group of people. Every person is different. I think it's estimated that something like 5 to 10% of our microbiome is actually shared. Most of it is different than anyone else's, and
Hmm.
it's incredibly resilient. So that means that the more we eat, the more we expose our immune system, which is primarily in our gut, to different foods instead of eliminating a bunch of foods, we actually get more resilient and better prepared. And then through something called epigenetics, we're able to give what we've learned or what our body or immune system has learned to the baby. So if we're doing these crazy elimination diets and never exposing ourselves to fiber or veggies or things like that, it may be working, but it's quite possible that allergies and insensitivities can be passed on to the baby whose immune system has never been trained to fight foods that we just eliminated
Hmm.
because we were convinced plants were out to kill us. So
Interesting.
yeah, so one of the many things that I try to kind of gently approach, on
Okay, wait,
social media,
give
which
me
is
more. I'm so curious because you do so much research. What was like two big facts that you learned specifically about like women's body and their metabolism that like shocked you? Like what do you think most women don't realize is happening, like especially maybe in birth and stuff like that?
that's a good one. So first, I would have to say that probably the biggest one is the fact that the probably one that the brain shrinks during pregnancy in
Yeah.
synaptic pruning is what it's called. It's basically like the brain is starting to prepare for the importance of taking care of that baby. And to do that, you have to start getting rid, you only have so much bandwidth. You have to start getting rid of things that aren't as important. You know, again, oversimplifying a little bit, things like social and, things that maybe are, great in a dinner party, but skills that we don't need as much since we're going to be dedicating all of our time to the baby. The actual synapse, that synaptic pruning, almost like pruning a tree. Like I think I described it as like a haircut. You end up with less hair, but if you trim off what you don't want, you're actually happier with the final product. And
Hmm.
so if that didn't happen, and I would probably clarify
Yeah,
that brain
how does
shrinking,
that manifest? Like, you're just no longer interested or you're forgetting or
the a good chunk of that is actually, and it's a great question because like, it's not really a palpable or tangible thing, but neither is mom brain, which is crazy that that's almost used as a pejorative. Like, oh, it's just like this wonderfully complex neurological thing that's happening, and it's just dismissed as mom brain. Which I think if we were to take any one of the many, many things that a mom goes through in preparing for the baby in pregnancy or after, like like using my wife's example, I when we had our kids, I was a deep sleeper. I was raised in California. There were earthquakes I literally slept through. As soon as the kids were born, I can't sleep through the night if the dog's nails are tapping on the floor, or the littlest things. And that pales in comparison to the what happened between my wife taking care of the kid. She did way more for the sleepless nights, feeding the baby, and like it was amazing to watch the fact that she was able to, the watching the changes. Kind of that'll tie into how men can support it, because there's some good science showing that our contribution to the process actually is important for several months leading up to it. So it's not like, there's actually some interesting science that when the baby doesn't make it, it's very likely that a large portion of that could be that the male's contribution, his health, the genes, the many, many genes and the gene information that was encoded and passed on was a result of alcohol use is a big one, poor health. So that basically is getting passed along.
Yeah.
And when the sperm meets the egg and that DNA is created, it's not the highest quality. Maybe they were fragmented, or I'm not a neurologist, so I don't exactly know how to describe the failures of the DNA that's passed along. But what we do know is that the man's contribution to the process can either help or hinder the baby.
Hmm.
So if a man is healthy, has good habits, even if they are just psychological habits, if he's working out, if he's eating healthy, that changes our DNA. That actually changes our genes, rather, and that gets passed along to the baby, which is why it's much more easy for a dad who's very healthy and has a habit of being healthy, who then has a baby, for that baby to carry on those same characteristics. So it's not determined by genes, but it can make a big difference. So That's the biological portion. I think that pales in comparison to what dads can do on the social and emotional support front, which is moms doing. We will never, as guys, appreciate or fathom what it takes. I know if I were subjected to the sleep deprivation that my wife was, I'd be clinically insane by this point. Even if I go a couple days, just the hormones from when you're tired, that moms are talking about when you get sleep deprivation, you're craving sweets. And just the hormones, ghrelin and leptin, that kind of play off each other. One tells you you're full, one tells you you're hungry. When you get poor sleep, ghrelin, which is the one, ghrelin and leptin, because they play off each other, you are craving so much more sugar and fat and sweets. And the signal that tells you you're full doesn't arrive, and, not nearly as strong. So when you have consecutive, in mom's case, months and months of poor sleep, they're fighting that thing that's not taken into account for, like the calories in, calories out. Well, if you want to lose weight, you just got to grit through it. It's like, well, that doesn't account for that, among other things, and then you rely on caffeine. And that kind of goes into what we were talking about before, is caffeine. It'll give you kind of a false sense of energy, because what it does is, without going too deep into the, biochemistry, I'm not a biochemist anyways, so it can't be that deep. But, as we make energy throughout the day, we have this leftover called adenosine, and that starts to fill receptors throughout the body. As the day goes on, we build up adenosine, that pressure builds. That's what makes us feel tired. When we drink caffeine, the molecule looks exactly like adenosine. It starts filling up those receptors, but doesn't do anything on them. It's like a placeholder.
Fake out.
So we don't get that feeling of being tired, and we're like, man, I could really get through this, a long drive. But what happens is that adenosine doesn't just disappear. It starts accumulating now in the blood. And so when the caffeine wears off, we get that rush to the receptors. And that's partly what, the crash of when caffeine wears off. It's like we've artificially been delaying that signal for so long that when it does hit, it hits harder than if we just had, kind of naturally try to defeat it. And
So
so,
here's what I'm
mhm.
hearing, Jordan. The cool, interesting things that women's bodies are doing during pregnancy and with metabolism is, number one, our brains get pruned, i.e., they get shrunk, the neuroplasticity changes. Number two, your actual partner has a huge influence on your baby's metabolism, because they're like, even in the DNA from like sperm to egg, whatever habits that they're doing in that moment actually translates over. So there's a much higher chance that if dad was not drinking when, baby was made or whatever, then that can kind of cross over genetically. And then the third crazy thing is, you're saying that women's bodies experience a lot more like different biological factors than men. For instance, in that period of postpartum where there's very little sleep, even if they were eating the same as the man or the same as another woman who got the normal amount of sleep, the chances of them gaining weight is really high, because you are fighting these like sort of innate things that say, oh, I'm still hungry. Ooh, I want sugar, all those things. And I think all women can resonate with that, because a lot of people always say it's so hard to lose the baby weight, or I gained so much after having a baby. I mean, it's definitely like a universal truth that life's a bit different after having a baby. And so that's even different, I'd say, from a woman with a baby, a woman versus a baby. And then it's interesting. The very last thing that I was hearing is that, like, caffeine, it's like that's our little band-aid, eventually actually like makes it worse, because it just is the band-aid. It's not fixing anything, and just like any band-aid, you pull it off, and then the whole glacier underneath is still there and just getting worse and worse and worse. So you just want to sleep and crash more. And I think that's really interesting, because I do think that the science of less sleep and how it affects weight gain is really, like you said, not studied at all. And I think it's comforting too for like moms to know, like, this stuff is like it's hard. Like you said, if you just gritted through it, you're not necessarily going to get the same results as your husband or as a person not going through this process. So those are really cool things. The coolest thing I think I heard from that was the pruning and mom brain. I didn't really I actually had no idea about that.
How long does that last? Because mine hasn't gone away yet.
You're pruned. It's done. The neural networks have now been laid, so they just
Yeah,
all
When do
exactly.
they grow back?
Like you said, it's the research. Unfortunately, it's, women don't get their due in research, so there's not a whole lot of good. It's very likely that it could take something like up to 2 years for that to start to recover. but not that it recovers in the sense that it's reversed. It's just kind of permanent. Once you're a mom, you're always a mom. And
Mm.
so, and then like you were saying, the mom brain, it's kind of ridiculous when you hear, and these are kind of horror stories, but when you hear guys that get frustrated with either their pregnant, girlfriend or wife, or, once the baby's born, they're like, all right, time to, get back to your old body. I was like, there is no old body. There is, and I know it's obviously coming from a guy that's kind of, it can be discouraging. I would say from the guy's point of view, when whether it's stretch marks or they call it the fupa or things like that, those are that I don't know why it's a pejorative. Obviously, it's you guys are both you would have better input
Be
as
careful.
ladies than I would. Yeah, I know. All I can say for my portion is guys don't care. Any guy worth his salt doesn't care. I mean, those tell a story. Even my dumb scars from like motorcycle accidents or soccer injuries, I kind of like the scar because I'm like, oh, I remember. It kind of reminds me of the story. I thought that was pretty cool.
Right.
There's nothing that, even if given the option, for my wife to go back to before the kids, I wouldn't take it. There's no way. I'm like that. She is now who. I don't know. It's kind of, you get a little
Yeah.
emotional. I can't really put it into words. I
Yeah.
wish she could feel for her or she could feel for herself what I feel for her. But
Yeah.
that's just, it's, as humans, we're always trying to look to better ourselves. And it's, at least from a guy's point of view, it's some of those changes I'm sure are disheartening. You kind of have expectations that maybe aren't realistic for current circumstances. But even like the mom brain thing that can be overcome and reversed. A lot of it is getting better sleep can start to fix that. As a final thing for mom brain, without going too deep, one last thing is getting enough sleep can make a huge difference. And that's one of the biggest things that you can do almost right away, because every night when you go to sleep, your brain cells actually shrink considerably. Your spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, washes in and takes out these sticky proteins called tau and beta amyloid that kind of accumulate from the day, washes them out. You feel clear, you wake up, and you're kind of refreshed and ready to go about the day. When you get, as a mom, 2-3 hours sleep or spotty sleep, waking up to feed the baby, that kind of accumulates. But as you start to get better sleep again, which is a good portion of what men can do to help support, mom taking care of the baby, is do whatever we can. I say, I don't know what the demographic is, how many guys are watching, but do what we can to support the fact, because we can't ever match the actual work that's going into being pregnant or having the baby. So as much support as we can throw mom's way, the better. There's no way to, overstate how important that could be. But
And getting sleep,
there's,
right?
yeah, getting enough sleep and making it so that mom can get enough sleep. That may very well be helping clean around the house because mom feels it's her responsibility. And if it's not done, she can't rest. And, my wife is, she's crazy busy all the time looking for things to be productive with and, cleaning. She's got the kids healthy and happy, and I don't ever have to worry about the kids. And so that's huge for me. And the way I can, show and repay that is, let me take some of the weight off of you and make it so that the hit that you took to bring the babies into the world could be a little bit at least alleviated, and letting yourself get back to where things like exercising or
Right.
you
You
know
can't even get to some of the other stuff if you don't have that. And I feel like that's way under expressed, because I mean, support is talked about a lot. A lot of it, like within the postpartum sphere, support gets brought up a lot in terms of like how can we take the extreme stress of postpartum away, like even a little bit. And support is brought up a lot, but a lot of it comes as like kind of community support,
Mm.
and relationship stuff gets brought up too, communication and things like that. But like, sleep is like it to me, it does, thinking now that I'm thinking about it, seem like number one because you can't really do much else without it. It's kind of like at the top of like the hierarchy.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Yeah, and
And
Mhm.
it makes
it's
such a
so
difference.
simple. It's like find ways that I can sleep more.
Yeah, yeah, even that could be its whole own podcast of just the things that can optimize sleep. And we've talked about some of them, like artificial lights deep into the night, having your phone screen up to your face. We have
But it's
receptors all over
really
our skin
just
for light. But
it's
it's
really just
difficult.
time. It's really just
Mhm.
time, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, most of it, like, yeah, you can optimize it for sure, but I feel like most moms with little babies right now are not like, how do I optimize the minimal amount of sleep I have? They're like, yeah, if I could go from like 4 to 6 hours, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, putting all of our bandwidth into tiny little, stepping over a dollar to pick up a dime. And
Yeah.
so that's a great point. It's the basics will always be, the last thing we didn't really touch on a whole lot, but is exercise. Obviously in our training programs that we've worked together, it's, what you kind of imagine having a personal trainer may be versus the basics of a good workout, not even breaking a sweat, but getting the muscles going. The muscles are an endocrine organ, so helping to regulate those hormones. Unless you have, and I'm not a doctor, even if one is a doctor and it's not your doctor on Instagram, the medical advice is if there is no medical contraindication saying you shouldn't do it, then exercise is one of the best things that you can do throughout pregnancy. After obviously the trauma of birth, whether it's C-section or natural birth, is huge. So that'll kind of play its own thing. But throughout pregnancy, the leading experts and OBGYNs and everybody will say one of the best things you can do is, unless you have a very particular need that your doctor has said, don't do this. Resistance training and cardio, I would say primarily resistance training because it's so metabolically active. It's so good for longevity. The muscles, everything from blood sugar that we talked about, the blood sugar regulation, muscles will actually take up that blood sugar, which is why it flows around in the blood, which is how you can measure for diabetes, is how much is still floating around in the blood, not being taken up by the muscles. So, there are things you can do to kind of mitigate it. Unfortunately, it's throwing a cup of water on a fire. It's not going to put it out. Pregnancy is going to be
Mhm.
a crazy process, but
Mhm.
at least the things that I've come across that I found can be helpful. It's all I can really offer. Unfortunately, I wish I could do more, but
That's what I love about you, Jordan, is like definitely your whole thing is it's kind of reassuring that you can just have a more clear idea as a woman of like what to expect, like you're like, oh, okay, like I have all these expectations over here, but this is actually what my body's going through. Like these are actually the goals I should sort of hit, which is like lift a weight and maybe walk a little bit and get 1/2 hour more of sleep, or my unique, diverse microbiome, or my unique, diverse, like, you know, schedule with my kids and my work or whatever. Like a whole lot of what I learned from you is that diet and exercise, if it was so simple, if it really was calories in, calories out, we could hand a book to everybody and we'd all be thin. But it's like a super unique process. And the process that pregnant women are going through is just like not even considered. And I think that's what makes, for me at least, like losing weight so daunting, because the things that motivate me, because I guess I'm shallow, is like I just want to be skinny and hot and look, like I have all these unrealistic expectations. So if I don't meet them, I'm just like, cool, what's the point? And I feel like with you, it's really helpful because you're just like, no, like it is big. Like get that hour more of sleep. Like no, like listen to this body thing that like think about how crazy this thing that you're doing, and like no, it's not realistic to maybe bounce back or whatever. So, yeah, I definitely think it's like, again, if you could go on this podcast and be like, "All right, pregnant women, here's the 5 things you're going to do, and if you do it, like it's all going to work out." Like that's the whole point of
yeah,
having a trainer, is like it's not that simple. I mean, yeah, it's obvious. Try to eat healthy, try to work out, try to get some sleep, try to drink some water, try to have a healthy, happy partner who supports you. But how does that look for the individual woman is like
yeah,
so
totally.
different. So I feel really blessed that we both got to experience working with you, because I know we both learned a lot, even though, Megan, we had varying degrees of participating in the program.
Hey, I'm not going to cross any HIPAA violations here. I'll let you talk amongst yourselves.
I know. I had a lot of shit going on.
Yeah.
I'm genuinely impressed with both of you, the dedication to, not only just the podcast, but we're each doing our own, little grain of salt that we can put on the pile to help. Like you said, it's so daunting. The state of science. It's not, like you were talking about, your goals may seem shallow. It's like I've yet to find one person who doesn't care about their appearance.
Hmm.
That's how we present ourselves to the world. So that's obviously going to play a factor. But science has yet to offer a good, amount of effort and time and energy spent on the things that by all rights we should have established literature from 50 years ago, better understanding women's bodies, metabolism, the menstrual cycle, and even if you're not pregnant, the second half of the menstrual cycle, luteal phase after ovulation, you put on a couple pounds, 2, 3, 4 pounds easily, and that's fluid. And you step on the scale, you don't know that, and I've gained 3 pounds. If you don't know how metabolism works, you think you've synthesized 3 pounds of body fat, and you look at the scale and you're like, I knew this wasn't going to happen. And of course, it's a worst time emotionally to be able to handle that kind of, mini despair. And then, cycle starts all over again, seems to remedy itself, and you go on. And none of that is ever explained to women, how that role plays, or, you know, we could make 50 podcasts about what has yet to be discovered or what has intentionally been. You had Dr. Christine Pieton on recently, and she was really diving into pelvic floor health. I mean, that is another thing that after having our kids, going through it with my wife and being with her and all the appointments, the sorely lacking state of, the fact that there are different kinds of muscle, and the people who are taking care of her didn't understand that there's skeletal muscle, there's smooth muscle like the intestines. We have that cool peristalsis that works food through our intestines, and the menstrual cycle takes place with smooth menstrual cramps or primary dysmenorrhea. They're not like regular bodily skeletal muscle, it's smooth muscle, so it's involuntary, and so you can't approach cramps like you would with, well, I'm
Skeletal
running, I'm
muscle.
starting to cramp up and have some pickle juice, or electrolytes. It's totally different. No one's ever taught that, and it was super frustrating for me, but it was really kind of nice to dive into some of that and
I have like
realize
a
that it
I
wasn't
have
just
like a bonus question because this
go for it.
happens to like everyone, and I'm like a member of all of these kind of pregnancy Facebook groups because I like seeing the questions people ask. But what like okay, so you have a big belly, you have a baby in your belly, you're 9 months pregnant, you've gained up this weight, the scale creeps up, 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 up. And then you have the baby, and I think, like, with both babies, I was expecting that scale to go down more than, you know, 7 pounds, 2 ounces or whatever, because there's, like, all the, like, the placenta comes out and, like, a bunch of, like, all kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
But, like, why do you only lose, like, 9 pounds after the baby? Like, I don't know. I was, like, and it took so and it was like my body was like, I felt like I looked somewhat similar, but I had, like, 15 p extra pounds, and I was like, "What is it?" Like, is it, like, organ weight? Or, like, why do women weigh I don't know. Is that
Yeah, it's a
do you
great
understand my
question.
question? Like, I
Yeah, I totally do. Yeah,
yeah.
well put. It's hard to explain because the math doesn't math. It's
The
like,
math
okay,
isn't mathing, that's right.
yeah, yeah. I'm I'm too old to get those correct. And yeah, the math isn't mathing. It's like, how does that? It doesn't really seem to make sense, because if you add up everything that came out, like you said, the placenta, the baby, even the amniotic fluid and everything, it's like it doesn't add up to what. But I seem to, be back. A lot of that kind of goes back to some of the changes that are happening for 9 months, building up to, like just the blood alone is potentially, 2 liters by the time the end of the third trimester. And so, your blood
Oh,
volume goes way
forgot
up.
about
There
the
could be
blood.
The blood can go way up. There can be other changes. Sometimes there's actually, depending on, mom, there's different kinds of fat. So sometimes you don't see, what's called visceral fat. And then there's ectopic fat, which is kind of intra-organ. It's typically not the case, but sometimes where fat is deposited is very different, because hormones dictate where the fat goes. They can't make you fat or create fat, but they can dictate where the fat is assigned. And going through those hormonal changes, you kind of start to carry it differently. So sometimes it kind of goes under the radar and it starts to slowly disappear. There could be a few other factors, but I mean, most of it is kind of, there are many, many different kinds of tissue. I couldn't exactly put, an amount of what takes, the most of the weight, so to speak.
I
But
think the most common thing, like from people that I've given in labor and delivery, is just it's pretty hard on your body. I mean, there's a lot of healing, so it's just a lot of inflammation and swelling. I think a good amount of, like, right after you give birth, right? You'll like weigh yourself. They always like put you, on the scale when you're walking, and you're like, what? Like, I'm 8 pounds down. Like, wasn't my baby like 9? It's because it takes so much of your blood to get all the things it needs to heal all those different parts of your body. So I think you're so swollen, just like if you hurt any other part of your body, like when you roll your ankle, it'll puff up because everything's like going in there. And I think it just takes a while for the inflammation to come down, and then that
Yeah.
takes like a week. And then it's kind of like then you really know what your body actually is, maybe after a week
So
versus
basically what I'm hearing is that the scale couldn't be less important at that specific time.
Yeah. I mean, in working together, how much emphasis did I put on the number that's on the scale? Not
Yeah. I
a
mean,
whole lot.
yeah.
'Cause it can't, it only tells you what the sum total is. It doesn't tell you how much muscle, how much fat, how much fluids. Obviously it's ideal to weigh yourself at the same day in, regards to your cycle because of that fluid retention that can happen more in the luteal phase and the follicular phase. So there's a lot to it. And looking at the scale can be disheartening and kind of play with you psychologically when it's not telling you, hey, you actually made progress. And,
Mhm.
it may very well be that you added muscle and lost fat, but because muscle is more dense than fat, the number actually creeps up a little bit, which is often the case. And you see a net gain. And even though your clothes are fitting better, and even though you feel better and you're more energetic and you feel your sleep is better, that single number on the scale is enough to defeat you. So it's not that it's totally irrelevant. It's a great tracking tool, but I think it's kind of one of those relics from the 80s and 90s. It's like the number is all that matters. I don't care body composition. I don't care, which is unfair, but society seems to have placed enough energy and bandwidth onto that it's as important as it is to as many of us that it is. So unfortunate, but yeah, I would agree with that.
And I have this like recollection from like college. So I don't even know if this is a true fact, but I remember like they were also saying like the type of fat, like if it's the fat that's like within, like woven in between your organs versus like the fat around your hips that's like just sort of chillin' fat. I don't know how they explained it, but they were
Yeah.
like fat also is different too. Like fat in your belly is like usually, I don't know if this is true. So you just tell me, but I have this idea that like also the type of fat is some is way more harmful to your health and some isn't. So like your boobs, your butt, your hips, thighs, I think those are supposed to be like less if they're the like external fat versus
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
organ fat.
Yeah, it's called subcutaneous fat, which just means under the skin, which is, if you're at 0% body fat, you're dead. So you need body fat. It's just, and it's actually a remarkable tool that our body's able to store energy so we don't have to be walking from bush to bush, packing on berries and finding an animal to eat. We actually have the ability to store fat. So that's a good thing. The downside is when we have 30, 40% of our body's fat, we have way more energy than we're ever going to use. And
Yeah.
it's an endocrine organ, adipose tissue. So it's actually playing on hormones. Subcutaneous fat, you're totally right, doesn't have nearly as much to do with health as something like visceral fat, which is kind of the intra-organ fat, or ectopic fat, which is actually like in the organs. So there are a lot of things that, it's much healthier to have subcutaneous fat than it is visceral or, the in with the organs. You don't want that. And that's typically a result of poor health. So
And I
yeah,
think
that's
that's
a
the
very good
thing
point.
once you become a mom. I mean, a lot of women, it's like your hips are wider, your fat is on your butt, your boobs get sometimes a lot bigger, especially when you're breastfeeding. Like I think a lot of times too, the fat you're gaining is this like woman fat. I don't know.
Mhm.
And I do
Yeah.
also think it's like the hardest fat to get away, but it is
And it would stand to reason because it serves a purpose. Like you were saying,
yeah.
well, why is my weight not dropped? Well, if you're breastfeeding, you have several pounds between the milk and the tissue that supports it that is not going to go away, and you don't want it to go away. You'd have to really be worried about the number on the scale to sacrifice something that's, as good a design as, specifically holding that so as to feed the baby. It's worth the
Yeah.
wait.
Dude,
Mhm.
no
Yeah.
joke.
Yeah, it's a
So
great question.
I would weigh myself when I was like fully engorged, and then I'd weigh myself right after I fed the baby. And I swear the weight would go down 2 pounds. Like just before it,
Yeah, it
like
doesn't surprise me.
I felt like
And
I
the
had
baby's weight would go up 2 pounds.
like I was
Yeah.
like, how much milk is in here? Like,
Yeah, it's so
this is
fascinating. That could be its whole other episode also, just,
mm,
of feeding baby, the temperature regulating that you can do with the baby, the like effects that the breast milk can have on baby's, personality, DNA, gene expression. It's so cool. That'll be a coming fact, I suppose.
excellent. All right. Well, I think we
Yeah.
could go on and on and on. I think the one thing I definitely wanted to shout out is that your Instagram is also like you're starting a lot in Spanish, which I think is great because you're just trying to get all this info out there, English. Spanish. So you guys absolutely should follow his Instagram, Lull, forgettable fat guy. Fat guy, forgettable.
Guy.
That's what it sounded like in the intro too.
I
Forgettable
know,
fact guy.
I was
I think I
like-
may have to just co-opt that. It's catchier.
Oh no, forgettable fact guy. And if you want to do his training, it's, with great optimization. It's his own thing. It's really awesome. If you're like me, it was fantastic because it was more therapy than anything else. So, Jordan
Well, I'm
knows
really
my
glad to
whole
hear it.
inner world now. And I don't know, is there anything else we're missing there?
I would say if there's anything that I could pitch, it would be if resistance training and exercise, obviously a lot of people have this idea that to get healthy, you have to sweat, you have to be in pain, you have to get your butt kicked. A good workout rarely is correlated with soreness, with sweating, getting the muscles active, even if it's a small workout, small baby steps, you don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good. If you have little things around the house, just body weight squats, lunges, things that you can do to kind of feel like your body's functioning, working with you instead of against you. Again, baby steps, any small steps will lead in the right direction. So it's kind of like a ship, even if you just change the rudder a tiny bit, in the long run, it can make a huge difference. And so I enjoy helping people kind of appreciate that it's not what, TV and social media has done a huge disservice, that for workouts to be effective, you have to destroy your body. And it's just not true. Very unfortunate, but it seems like science is starting to catch up, and a lot of good communicators out there, a lot of good pages. If you go to who I'm following, there's a bunch of them on there that I really enjoy and that have been at least somewhat screened. So yeah, no, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and kind of speak to your audience. And there's again, so much disinformation out there. I suppose I could leave it with a little anecdote if you'd like. So fear mongering is the big thing that I'm trying to avoid. If we were to take even the most benign substance like water, there's so many pages out there that are telling you what you can't eat, what you have to avoid, chemicals this, microplastics that, glyphosate that. It's horrible, but we can't get discouraged by that. Even if you were to take, the number one leading cause of kids from 1 to 4 is drowning. I could reframe that to attack water. Water, we could call it, is it dihydrogen monoxide? Yeah, dihydrogen monoxide, DHMO. I could say the number one leading cause of children 1 to 4 is acute DHMO chemical ingestion. And that's a way of saying drowning. But I could reframe that as this chemical, water, is killing you. It's the number one cause. And you could reframe things to be super scary. Mm-hmm. We hear the expression, just enough to be dangerous. Very little out there is actually out to kill you. If you're trying to live a healthy lifestyle, if you're trying to eat healthy, trying to move, chances are you're much better off than people who are just waiting for the perfect diet to come along. So again, any small changes that can be made, any small tweaks, if guys are listening, support your pregnant wife or the baby or mom as best you can, because that's about as much as we can do. So do it as best you can. And hopefully that makes enough of a difference to make the whole process as happy for everybody as it can be.
I love it. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having you. It was fascinating as always, and we can't wait to see more forgettable facts from you. And we'll make sure to drop a link to your website and your Instagram and anything else we talked about in the description. So thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to the Raising Mama podcast. Your presence means a lot, and we hope you found our discussion insightful.
Become a part of our community. Follow us on Instagram at Raising Mama Podcast. Explore resources on the Raising Mama Village located at www.raisingmama.com.
You're never alone on this motherhood journey. We're here to support you every step of the way.